Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us on the Network Breakfast. Today we have a special guest, Rick Porrello, author and screenwriter and musician, and he's going to tell us all about Bombs, Bullets, and Bribes, Shondor Birns, from here in Cleveland, where we're located. And for today, I'm going to ask Dan to tell us a little about himself, and we'll ask Bruce to give us a 1 minute, and then we're going to go ahead and hand it over to Rick, and he'll take over for us after we hear from Dan and Bruce. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning. Thank you for having me, everybody. I really appreciate it. My name is Dan Flywell, and as Mike said a little bit earlier, I'm a Solon resident, and I've been in the insurance business for about 25 years. I'm a small group rep for Aetna, selling all 2 to 100 medical in the Northeast Ohio area. And Mike invited me this morning because he knows I'm a little bit of a history buff, and certainly the American Mafia part of things, and very interested in Danny Green. I moved here in 1990. And my wife actually worked in the Cedar Brainerd building, and first thing we heard was, well, that was where Danny Green bought it. So that was really our first introduction to Cleveland. Very interested in all the, obviously the crime families and certainly what happened here in Cleveland. So I just want to say thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it and look forward to it.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for joining us today. Good morning, Bruce. Let's hear 1 minute.
Hi, I'm Bruce Gigax. I'm owner of Audio Recording Studio in Bentleyville. I've been in the recording business for 43 years. We do mostly jazz and acoustic, classical. I was Cleveland Orchestra audio supervisor for 32 years. And I'm here because my wife Trina invited me, and I wanted to hear what Rick had to say, and knowing he was a drummer for a jazz drummer, I was interested in that as well as the other topic.
Great. Thank you, Bruce. And now we're going to, each of us are going to forego our 1 minute. Our Jeff Hexter, Chris Walters, the master photographer, Scott Morrison, Trina, Harry Bernstein, Esquire, Lee Jackson, and Mike Bentley and Marty Kelbel. And all of their contact information will be listed below the video, okay? So at this particular time, I'd like to introduce my friend and the author of Bombs, Bullets, and Bribes is Rick Porrello. Good morning, Rick. Please take the...
Good morning, Tom. Thank you for having me, and good morning, everyone. And Tom, you're going to enable me to share my...
I have done that, yes.
Slide presentation. Okay. Because really it's the pictures that tell the story. I'm more of a narrator more than anything. But somebody mentioned the Brainerd Place Medical Building, and Tom already told you a little bit about my music background, but most of you may know that I was a police officer for 33 years. And in 1988, I moved from the village of Mayfield to the city of Lyndhurst. And I worked there for about 2 or 3 years before I knew that the Brainerd Place Medical Building was referred by many people as the Danny Green Building. So that was rather surprising to me. So I always remember that. All right, so let's see if I could pull up my slide presentation here. I think I need to click a couple things here. Okay. And we'll go ahead and get started. As I said, it's really the slides that tell the story. So we'll move right along here. So I'm often asked, how did I get interested in writing about organized crime? Let's see if I can move that out of the way. And it really has to do with my grandfather being killed in 1932. As I was growing up, I don't know, maybe 10 years old. So this would have been in the early 60s. I heard tell that my grandfather had been murdered years and years ago, and that it had something to do with the mob. But I was never told anything more than that. It's not something that my father, it was my paternal grandfather. It's not something he talked about. Nobody really talked about it. But just knowing that, you might say, planted a seed for me to do further research, which of course led to my first book, The Rise and Fall of the Cleveland Mafia, and the book that probably best known for, To Kill the Irishman, the story of Danny Green. His name has already been brought up here, and which was adapted for the film Kill the Irishman. And I'm quite fortunate to have that book made. It was quite a long process. The book came out in 1997. before it actually hit the shelf, it was there was a producer who optioned the rights to make a film, but nothing really happened until quite a ways later. It was 2009 when the project was green lighted and they filmed. Unfortunately, they filmed, and it was purely economic reasons. They filmed in Detroit, so Detroit portrayed Cleveland, and then the film came out in 2011. It's actually on Netflix now. It's got some pretty darn good reviews, pretty good review on IMDb. So I'm really thankful and thrilled that the project finally got made. I think Tommy Reed, the original producer who took an interest and sort of shepherded this project all along. Super Thief is my now my second last title, and that is actually in advanced development for a motion picture. And that's the story of Phil Christopher, a Cleveland native who was really a super thief. He was dubbed Super Thief in the newspaper. And it's the story of the biggest bank burglary in U.S. history. And I stress burglary as opposed to robbery, which is a stick-up. It's a crime against a person. These guys were property burglars, and they broke into this bank. They broke into a lot of establishments and businesses, a lot of banks, jewelry stores, and most of the time they'd go in through the roof for the banks. And it's quite an interesting story told from his perspective, from Phil Christopher's perspective. So it's an inside story, and the thing I like about it is he doesn't pull any punches about the mistakes that he made in life. I think it was a genuine, honest telling of the story, and that's what interested me in collaborating with his wife and with Phil. Okay, Shondor Birns, the subject of this presentation, probably Cleveland's most notorious Jewish racketeer, was brought from Austria-Hungary as an infant. He was born in 1906, brought to the U.S. in 1907, along with the influx of European immigrants. And as a young boy, as he got a little bit older, he worked as a newspaper boy on the corner. A lot of these, they call them newsies, and it was a tough little job because oftentimes they had to fight for control of key intersections. Shondor and his family grew up around East 55th and Woodland. You're seeing a shot of that one particular angle of that intersection there. And it was a busy intersection, a lot of Jewish people, a lot of Italian people, Hungarians in that particular region or neighborhood of Cleveland. So as he grew older with these kids, some of them were older kids. They were the ones that might drive the trucks, and they were some of them were affiliated with organized crime gangs in Cleveland. That's one of the ways that Shondor, as a young man, as a boy, and then a young man, got sort of taken into that circle of criminals. Prohibition, we're talking now about 1920, 21. A lot of people had in-home stills, perhaps to earn some extra money, perhaps for religious reasons. They continued to consume alcohol. There were a lot of in-home stills. They had them in attics. They had them in bathrooms. You've heard of perhaps bathtub gin. So this was prohibition. And going back to my grandfather, and I don't want to get into it on the presentation. It's really a whole separate thing. But what was happening back there? There was a war in Cleveland for control of corn sugar, and corn sugar was used to ferment into corn liquor, which was a very popular homemade booze before people acquired more of a taste for the good stuff that came in from Canada through the rum runners. But in-home stills were popular, and my grandfather and the other big faction, the four Leonardo brothers, they had a system where they would provide the raw ingredients for people who had in-home stills. And then when they made the product, the brothers would buy that product back, give them a profit, of course. But the conflict over the sugar war resulted in the death of my grandfather and three of his uncles. There were seven brothers altogether, seven Porrello brothers. and 3 of the 4 Leonardo brothers. So that's a story in and of itself, told in detail in my first book, The Rise and Fall of the Cleveland Mafia. So Shondor Birns and his family had a still in their apartment in the East 55th and Woodland Avenue area. And what happened sometimes with these stills, they were not hooked up properly. And sometimes there were gas leaks and there were resulting fires, and sometimes people got hurt. And that's what happened with Shondor Birns' mother. She was horribly burned from a still fire, and she died. She was only 36 years old. It was 1920. Shondor was just a teenager, so it was a pretty traumatic period of time for Shondor and his family. Eventually, the father, Shondor's father, remarried, and they really were a pretty functional blended family. Shondor loved his stepmother as his own, and she loved Shondor as his own. So as her own. As we moved on in time a little bit, Shondor's 18, 19, 20 years old. He was hanging out at a place called the Halt North Recreation Company. It was a pool hall. There was a grill there. They had a bowling alley, and Shondor worked in there. And eventually, he got involved in selling bootleg booze out of sort of an office that he had there, and also taking sports bets. And along with that, Shondor had an interest in restaurants. He became affiliated. We'll see him in a moment. At the time, probably the most notorious Jewish racketeer in power was a man, we don't hear his name mentioned too often, but a pretty powerful figure by the name of Maxie Diamond, who was tied in with better known Jewish racketeers like Mo Dalitz and Lou Rothkopf and Maury Kleiman. And you know, as a little aside, sometimes I get a little criticism or get poked a little bit by people who say that as I give presentations about the mafia, I'm speaking poorly against the Italians and bringing up something that I shouldn't be bringing up. But I got to tell you, every ethnicity has been represented in organized crime. And the Jewish racketeers back there and the Jewish mobsters were as powerful as the Italian mobsters. But as time went on, and you had they left conflicts like the Sugar War and all that bloodshed in the wake, and they began to take their criminal enterprises and organize them. They really got organized and treated them more like a business. So after the Sugar War and the demise or the fall from power, I should say, they weren't all murdered, of the Porrello and Leonardo brothers. The Porrello brothers were pretty much out of it, but what the remnants of the larger and more powerful Leonardo organization were absorbed by the Mayfield Road mob. That was another mob group that was gaining a lot of power very quickly. They had political clout. They had men on the streets, capable soldiers, men like Frank Brancato and Charlie Coletti, hitmen. And so Shondor Birns, and they were headquartered in Little Italy, Murray Hill, excuse me. And one of the things that Shondor got involved with the Mayfield Road mob was his involvement in gambling, in particular Policy and Clearinghouse, which were controlled mostly by black racketeers. So lottery and Policy and Clearinghouse were forms of lottery, which are the random selection of numbers. It was also called the numbers racket, more commonly known as the numbers racket. And it was really just it was the precursor to the Ohio lottery, which would come around in the early 1970s. We'll talk a little bit about that shortly. So Policy was the first of the games, and it involved it involved 100 little tiny balls that they would place inside a bag. And what you're looking at are actual balls. Now, these are cheat balls. You could see that they're not completely round, and we'll get to that in a second. And then you're looking at winner's slips. So they put the balls inside a bag, and then they would select the numbers out of there, and then they would print the win slips, and then those would be distributed throughout the community. And they would have, excuse me, they would have policy houses very popular in the 55th and Woodland Avenue, and they would basically get a large group of people that would gather on the front lawn of a policy house, and the operator would conduct the drawing and then give out the winning numbers. It attracted a lot of attention. It was easy for the police to find because there'd be cars all parked through the neighborhood there'd be a noon drawing, and then there might be a drawing later in the evening, sometimes even 3 drawings in one day. So there's an example of an actual policy bag and the balls that are inside. Now policy, and here's some of the leaders back then, and these men ran legitimate policy operations, and they're well known in Cleveland gambling history. So policy was easy to cheat because you got these little balls and they're in a bag, and they have the drawer reach his hand in, shuffle the balls up, and then pull the bags out. One of the ways that they cheated was, you look at the bag on top, you'll see it's got these little fingers, you might call them, where the balls that they wanted the drawer to pick were stuck inside those sleeves. And the way they determine that is with all numbers operations is when they cut off the time for the bets to be taken. You know, they'd be taken up to a certain time. Maybe for a noon bet, it might be 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. And they would chart, the numbers operator would chart those bets. So he would know how much he would have to pay out if certain numbers were hit. It was easier to figure with the clearinghouse, which we'll get to in the next slide. But they would cheat in policy by putting the balls that they would want picked by the drawer inside those little fingers. And of course, somebody standing really close to the person doing the draw cannot see what's going on inside the bag. The other thing they had in the bag on the bottom is they had a sleeve that they would put the balls that they wanted pull, or it might have even been the balls that they did not want pulled. And they pushed them up inside that sleeve so the drawer would know either to pull or not to pull from the sleeve. Okay, so we're up to about 1928 here, and just as another sort of a little aside, although it kind of goes along with the story, because Shondor Birns became known all over the country. I mean, he wasn't like an Al Capone or a John Gotti, but he had major connections in Los Angeles, in Las Vegas, in New York, in Chicago, down in Miami, especially where he would take vacations. He was connected in with this network. He even had money invested in casinos in Cuba. We're going to talk about that also. So here's the first known national meeting of the Sicilian Mafia. Now, back during that period of time, you had to actually have Sicilian roots to be considered part of the mafia. Now, not all organized crime was the Sicilian American Mafia. For instance, Al Capone had a huge gambling a huge racketeering operation in Chicago, but he was not Sicilian. But this meeting was held, but due to a very observant beat cop in Cleveland in the early morning hours, he saw these men pulling in their fancy clothes and with their fancy luggage and their cars, and he went in, took some names down. Eventually, a meeting was raided, but this meeting was hosted by the Porrello brothers, and it was a big embarrassment to them and sort of a testament to their lack of being as powerful as the Leonardo operation or the coming Mayfield Road mob. Okay, so here's Maxie Diamond. We talked about him, pretty significant character in the 55th and Woodland Avenue. He got out, now he was a mentor of Shondor Birns. Shondor Birns was sort of a protege. Maxie was also involved in clubs, nightclubs, restaurants, and he eventually got out of the mob business and had a restaurant for quite a while in Shaker Heights. So he was a pretty smart guy. Took his money that he made illegally, invested it into legal enterprises. Okay, as Shondor got more involved in the mob, the Mayfield Road mob, when I forgot to mention, when Maxie Diamond got out of the 55th and Woodland gang that he had headed up, Shondor Birns moved in and he took over that gang for a short period of time, and then sort of assimilated into the Mayfield Road mob, and then really became his own his own man. He operated independently, but you might say in alliance with the Cleveland Mafia. Benny Mason, Cleveland's first policy boss. Here's some other figures involved in gambling. Arthur Little Brother Drake. He had a son named Richard, who we'll talk about shortly, and Virgil Ogletree. Shondor Birns was a real playboy. He loved women in their young 20s when he was in his late 20s. And when he was in his late 30s, he liked women in his young 20s. And when he was in his 50s, he liked women in their young 20s. He liked very attractive women. It did not matter what color they were. Another notorious numbers figure from Cleveland history is Donald the Kid King, who you may not know was very involved in the numbers racket, and was both an enemy and then later a friend of Shondor Birns. And he emerged, of course, as Don King, the fight promoter, in the late 70s. Okay, Richard Drake on the left. Richard Drake was the son of Arthur Drake. They had a big numbers operation. When little brother Drake, Arthur Drake, passed away, his son Richard Drake took over the operation. Now, Richard was light complected. His hair was kind of light, sort of red tinged. Shondor Birns' hair was a little bit lighter, sort of red tinged. And I spoke to a couple of people in the black community that were in the know with the history there, and they believe that Richard was actually Shondor Birns' biological son, and I tend to believe that for another reason related to a family member. So, a little interesting part of the story there. And in later years, late 60s and into the 70s, these guys were very close. And they were actually partners in their own numbers operation, including the other roles that Shondor served as an enforcer and as a financier. So all of the numbers operations they had going, they wanted to keep things running smoothly. When you had violence like you had with the sugar war, it attracted attention from law enforcement. That was not good for the operation. So Shondor was very good at corrupting the criminal justice system. He had judges in his pocket. A few. There weren't a lot, but there were probably more than there were now. There were corrupt, high-ranking police officers. He had a crew of enforcers. He had a crew of black enforcers. He had a crew of white enforcers who were also burglars and hitmen. And as far as being a financier, if one of these guys, I said they charted their numbers, and if they hit on a certain number in clearinghouse, which we'll get to, if they hit too big, you could lose. If you had to pay out, you could really lose your pants. And Shondor Birns was there to provide loans. And they also did things like cutting the number and also laying off bets. And these were all functions that Shondor Birns served within the numbers community. So here's an actual numbers slip that has notes and explanations put on by a Cleveland Police Department gambling expert. You see the date on the top, the writer's code, so they could identify who it is. And then you can see this gambler bet two numbers. Now this is clearinghouse. This is different than policy. It's a three-digit number. And the way they pick the number, the winning number in Cleveland anyway, it was through the stock market. And we'll see a slide of that, the daily stock market results. So in this case, he bet two numbers, 757 and 337, and he bet them both straight and boxed. And that's the reason why the box is around the numbers. Now this particular game was a bond game. So they used the stock market numbers, the daily numbers, and they also developed a bond game that used bond numbers, the daily in the newspaper financials. And this is how they picked the number for clearinghouse. You could see that they'd have the advances declined and the unchanged figures, and that's an actual copy of a newspaper on the right there. And then on the left of your screen, you see how they picked out those winning numbers. There were certain columns that they used to provide the correct numbers for the bond game and for the stock games, and they'd have different games that you could play, and some of them had different odds. Some of them might accept larger bets, because back in the 20s and 30s with policy, you had like penny bets, nickel bets, dime bets. And then, of course, as time went on, the 40s and 50s, people might bet a dime or a quarter. And then into the 1970s, they might bet a quarter, 50 cents, or even a dollar. All of these conflicts that Shondor got involved in created risk to himself. He was shot at, he was threatened, and for protection, he had a couple of Dobermans. I love dogs. I love this slide. Of course, these aren't Shondor's actual dogs, but he had two of them, and they're, let me see their names. You named one of them Fury, and another one was named Satan. So these dogs were protection for him and his family. He was married. He had one son, and then he got divorced and married a young woman who we will meet shortly. The social headquarters for the Mayfield Road mob was the Notorious Theatrical Restaurant down on Short Vincent off 9th Street. It was a unique kind of a place because you could have judges and defense attorneys sitting across at another table from racketeers, from gamblers, from burglars. And it was just quite a mix, but everyone there was a certain kind of respect that these men had, sort of the kind of respect you might have in a sporting event where you're on opposing teams, but you still have respect for each other. Okay, it was probably at the theatrical bar and grill that Shondor met this guy, Mervyn Gold. And I love this story. It makes up pretty much most of part 2 of Bombs, Bullets, and Bribes. The book is set into 3 parts, part 1, part 2, part 3. And this is, I think, a very exciting part and is actually key in what my co-writer, I'm working with a screenplay co-writer, we're using to develop a mini series based on a part of Shondor Birns' story, and we're just now starting to shop around for investors and producers and so forth. And that, believe me, that's a bit of a gamble too. That's like throwing dice. But save for the pandemic going on, it's a good time to be throwing the dice in this case because of the streaming wars that are going on, the money that is being pumped into streaming services and new services that are coming on board, and the kind of selection that most people want to have when they go on Netflix or Amazon or Hulu or whatever. So Mervyn Gold was a financial con man, and simply put, he knew how to make money on paper. Some people call him a genius. He may have been a genius in some respects, but he wasn't very smart at getting away with it, because if you look at his rise to success graphically, he rises very quickly to the top. He hits the top and he's already on his way back down. But he was very useful to Shondor Birns because he could produce money on paper and also gave out loans. Well, there was a problem that developed with some bonds that were stolen from Canada. And these bonds, I don't think we have much time to get involved with it right now, but these bonds were stolen in bank burglaries and robberies in Canada. And they were destined largely for use by the mafia to influence the Cuban Revolution to protect their gambling operations, which were bringing in huge amounts of money, casinos, tracks in Havana. Shondor, in addition to everything else he did as a racketeer, he was also a fence. He was a buyer of stolen property, and someone who would put he would put the buyer of stolen property together with the seller of the stolen property. So he was kind of a middleman, whatever it might be. It could be bonds, it could be jewelry taken in a heist. So that was one of the things he did. And about $1 million worth of these bonds wound up in Cleveland. And what happened is Shondor provided some of the bonds to Mervyn Gold, who accepted those bonds as collateral for a loan. Mervyn took those bonds to a bank and used those as collateral for a big loan. Eventually got caught. He was indicted for that, along with some other federal financial crimes. He fled the U.S. For Israel, tried to remain there under the law of return, much like let me see, Meyer Lansky would do about 10 years later. And his claim under the law of return, even though he fought it with an attorney for about a year or so, was rejected, and he was sent back to the U.S. And this graphic I have here just illustrates that it's an international story stretching from the U.S. to Israel and from Canada to Cuba. And suffice to say, when Shondor Birns got back and made some threats within the underworld, it did not go well for him. Here is in a major case against Shondor Birns. You have some county officials that are examining a tape recording that was found in Mervyn Gold's house and implicated some people in a crime. Here you have something you don't see anymore, a coroner's inquest into a homicide. And on the right there, you see a man who is still alive to this day, who's a friend of mine. His name is James Willis, and he is a longtime defense attorney. He is in his early 90s, and he is still working. I don't think he's doing a whole lot right now, trying to stay safe from the pandemic. But this was a coroner's inquest into a homicide on a hot day in July of 1963. Okay, I'm going to just try and pick up the pace just a little bit because we have a lot of slides to get through. So Shondor Birns was arrested many times. Again, he was very good at hijacking the criminal justice system and did not often go to prison. On occasion, he did. He met this young girl, Ellie Leonards, who became prominent in his life as an alibi witness in later months, or about maybe a year or two after he met her. He met her at a restaurant. She was moonlighting in the summer. She was a teacher, and she had recently graduated from Kent State University, and she met Shondor Birns at a restaurant in Garfield Heights where she was waiting tables and became enamored with him. And eventually, after Shondor's wife requested a divorce and was granted a divorce, she eventually became involved with Ellie became involved with Shondor Birns and eventually married him. And then this other guy we all know, Danny Green. I think most of us know him, the subject of To Kill the Irishman, and portrayed in the adaptation, the Hollywood adaptation, I should say, Hollywood adaptation of the story, Kill the Irishman. So Danny, an ILA, or Dock Workers Union product, got involved in racketeering and worked as an enforcer for men like Shondor Birns and Frank Brancato, who now, by the late 60s, were getting a little bit older and were starting to farm out some of their enforcement work if they had a problem with someone to some younger men like Danny Green. One of the times that Shondor did have to go to prison was in 1965. It was actually he stayed on the streets quite a while after, with appeals going on, and it wasn't until about, was it late 66 or early 77 that he actually did go to prison for about 3 years for being found guilty of bribing a Parma detective in connection with a gambling arrest, gambling charges against him. Before Shondor went to prison, he took Danny Green around for several months and introduced him to people so Danny could learn how his operation worked, how his own clearinghouse operation worked. I mean, Shondor accepted bets. He also took layoff bets. There was a lot of money involved in layoff bets, and what that was layoff men like Shondor and Joe Harper, who had homes both in Cleveland and in Pittsburgh, made a lot of money. They didn't accept bets from individual gamblers. They accepted layoff bets from the actual gambling operators who, after they would chart their bets and figure out if that 3-digit number, whatever it might be, 312, came out on that particular day. And sometimes it might be, a certain date or a holiday, and people would bet that month and day. And if it came out, again, an operator could lose his pants, and he had to pay out, because if you didn't pay out, you'd lose your reputation. The gamblers would go play with somebody else the next day. So they would chart their bets, and they would determine if that number, let's say 312, came out, how much would they lose? How much would they have to pay out? So they would bet a certain amount on 312 themselves. They would bet that with a layoff man. So if that number came out, of course, they'd have to pay their individual gamblers, the winners, but then the layoff operation man would pay them so that they would keep the whole operation going. One of the other things they would do was cut the number. So let's say that number 312 or Valentine's Day, I forget what that number is. If everybody bet that number on Valentine's Day and it came out, they might cut before the actual number came out, they would cut it. They would say, and they would circulate a slip throughout the neighborhood to say 312 or whatever number it was is being cut to even odds. So if the number came out, there really wouldn't be winners because they would just get their bet back. Okay, some of the men that Shondor had on his payroll. This guy on the left, is not too much written about him. I was quite surprised, and actually as an historian with this stuff, rather thrilled to be learning about Bob Bogus, who was both a burglar and a prolific, an alleged prolific mafia hitman. He was never actually indicted or convicted, but he was a suspect in several mob-related murders. And Mo Corelli, a burglar and an inventor. This guy had a pretty good head, but he was a brother almost of Bogus. They really were best friends. The Ohio Lottery came out 73 or 74, and what was their first game? The Buckeye 300. Go figure, a 3-digit number, right? So they basically took and legalized the number that was happening in the neighborhoods. Very, very popular in the black neighborhoods, mostly run by black operators, as I said, overseen by Shondor Birns and his crew to keep things running smoothly. But it was really the same thing, just legalized. Now people continued to play the neighborhood number because they had higher odds. If the Ohio Lottery, the 3-digit was, let's say, 500 to 1. The number was 600 to 1. They would also let some of their gamblers play on credit. You know, you couldn't do that with the Ohio Lottery. There were some other benefits too. Danny Green, there was a conflict that developed between Danny Green and Shondor Birns over money. After Shondor got out of prison, he went back to taking over his operation, and Danny Green pretty much didn't have a job anymore. And he got a loan from Shondor Birns. It was about $75,000. It either was involving drugs or it was to open a nightclub, maybe a little bit of both. But as you can see here, a couple of figures that were in Danny Green's own racketeering circle: Keith Ritson and a Hell's Angel by the name of George Rothrock. So this conflict developed between Danny Green and Shondor Birns. It's portrayed significantly in the movie Kill the Irishman. It's portrayed in my book To Kill the Irishman. And basically, these guys blamed each other over the loss of the $75,000, which was lost in a drug operation. Shondor blamed Danny Green, Danny blamed Shondor, and they started going after each other, shooting, mostly putting bombs on each other's cars and so forth. A couple of cases, or at least one case, Danny actually found the bomb and had it disconnected and took the explosive off, continued to threaten Shondor Birns, and their relationship of mentor and protege just in the early 70s, maybe 72, when Shondor was out of prison and reestablished on the streets, really just flipped 180 degrees and they became enemies. During that period of time, he said Shondor loved young women. I don't know if he was romantically involved with Christie's, who had Christie's Lounge at 25th in Detroit, but he was, they really liked each other a lot, and he may have been involved in helping her purchase, along with her brother, the old Jack and Jill's West Lounge, which he would rename Christie's. So as Danny Green was going after Shondor, they finally tracked him to Christie's Lounge. He would stop there during the evening after a visit to the theatrical and then the Silver Quill. He'd wind up at Christie's in the evening. They tracked him there, put a bomb on his car, and Shondor was killed instantaneously. And that was Holy Saturday, day before Easter, 1975. And interestingly, Christie's is almost across the street from a church that had been there for years, St. Malachi, in that area, which used to be a very heavily Irish area. Of course, major newspaper coverage, Shondor Birns. He was, I think, 69 years old when he was killed. So he'd been around for a long time. So now people loyal to Danny Green went after Danny, placed a bomb on his little small apartment building and office on Waterloo and Collinwood. Danny survived the blast. It's interesting to see. I won't give it away. It's interesting to see who hired the bomber that planted the bomb that time, and what Danny Green was doing in addition to running Shondor Birns' operation while Shondor was in prison. Some very interesting things that I think make excellent material, or potentially make excellent material theatrically. But in case anybody wants to read the book, I don't want to get too much into some of the fun details. John Scalish, Cleveland's longtime mob boss, became the head of the Cleveland mob around 1944. Died during heart surgery in 1976 and set off a war for control about who was going to be the boss. On one side was Jack Licavoli, or Jack White, they call him. And on the other side was Danny Green and a guy named John Nardi, who was a Teamster official. Together, they teamed up and tried to take over what was going on with the rackets, gambling operations, control the vending machine, skim money coming in from Las Vegas.
As a kid, we lived 4 doors down from Nardi. I think I told you guys that in South Euclid. Okay,
interesting. All right, so here we have, it's already been mentioned, the Danny Green building, or the Brainerd Place Medical Building, where they finally got Danny after numerous failed attempts with a car bomb. Again, there were a lot of bombs going off during that period of time. Not as many bombs and not as big of bombs as the movie would have you think. Again, great movie. It's got wonderful reviews. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to check it out. It's on Netflix, like I said. Kill the Irishman. And there's a unbelievable cast of talent in the movie. But this particular bomb was a pretty good sized one, placed on a car that was parked next to Danny Green when he went into the medical building there in Lyndhurst for a dental appointment. So as the convictions started rolling in, some members of the Cleveland mob felt that if they got involved with the big profits involved in drugs, that they could kind of recover lost ground, because some of the bosses went to prison. Some of the soldiers went to prison in both state and federal convictions that followed the murders of Shondor Birns and Danny Green. Many of them wound up dead at the bottom of quarries and ponds, and there was a lot of violence going on, which attracted the attention of law enforcement. And there was another federal indictment and convictions, including that of the boss who had taken over from Jack Licavoli when he went to prison, and that was Angelo Leonardo. You remember the Leonardo name from the Sugar War, and Angelo Leonardo was the son of one of the Leonardo brothers, Big Joe Leonardo, who back then was the mafia boss, who was murdered during the Sugar War. And Angelo, as a teenager, about 18 years old, avenged his father's murder by killing the man responsible, and then became involved in the mafia, and through the decades rose to the ranks to become the one-time acting boss of the Cleveland mob. He went to prison, got life, didn't last long. Back then, during the late 70s, early 80s, a lot of men were caught up in the organized crime dragnet and convictions, because there was a lot of progress being made by the federal government, working with state and local law enforcement agencies, prosecutors. There were strike forces, a tremendous effort to stamp out traditional organized crime, or La Cosa Nostra, or the mafia. And they had great success during the 1980s due to various things, including having certain insiders who would be convicted and given long sentences who would trade information for either leniency or for their freedom. And that happened with Angelo Leonardo. And you can see here, several years after Danny Green was killed, there was still damage being done to the Cleveland mob. There were still men who were falling in, and that damage was traced back to 5 years earlier, 1977, when Danny Green was murdered. So Ellie Burns, we already talked about her. Quite an interesting character. She married Shondor, and I'll leave it at that. It's an interesting, there's an interesting romantic aspect to it, and some things that you just would not think that a former school teacher who taught second grade and got involved with a notorious figure like Shondor Birns would be involved in, but she was. And there's Shondor Birns and Danny Green in real life, and there they are as portrayed by Ray Stevenson on the right as Danny Green, and Chris Walken on the left as Shondor Birns. And there's the DVD there. After Shondor was killed, Ellie Burns eventually sort of reinvented herself. She went to real estate school, became a realtor, and she lived and worked on the east side, Geauga County. She had an office and a residence in the Bainbridge and Chagrin Falls area. Unfortunately, I never got to talk to her. She died in the 1990s of cancer. Okay, some of the credits for the presentation today. And of course, I thank Tom Basie for having me and for that wonderful background that gives, I think, gave me a little bit of an international flair here. So at this point, Tom, I don't know if you want to have them, if there's any questions or comments, type them in, or if there's, if we don't have that many people, if we could do it, just verbally. It's up to you. I'm not sure how we would do that.
Well, actually, let's just see if does anybody have any questions we can just ask Rick about the book or the movie or any of the characters, Shondor himself, Danny Green.
Somebody mentioned that they live next to John Nardi, and oftentimes when I do these, and I've been hired to do these presentations for a couple of decades now, and a lot of times it's not the questions that are as interesting; it's the comments and the experiences that the audience has with being having experience with the people that were involved in these stories, or having some connection. Whether it's direct or indirect. But I think somebody had a question or comment. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, we spent a lot of time when you came in the last time, and you and I could talk forever, because my dad, our family business was a beer and wine distributor. We worked with two different Teamster locals, 293 and 377, and there was so much crossover with the mob. My dad knew all those stories and knew all those guys, and he grew up in Cleveland in the Glenville area. He's 91 now. And then my uncle did some non-criminal work for a lot of these guys. So I've heard these stories since I was a kid, and it's nice to hear you bring more to it, because as you said, it's like, oh, I knew that guy. I mean, as a kid, it's like the Nardis were nice people, but my parents were always like, yeah, you might not want to be playing, because my best friend lived next door and we'd play football in the yard. Again, very nice family. And then I'm a high school kid. I'm 57 now, and now these guys are all getting blown up, because if I recall it, he got blown up in front of the Teamster Hall.
Yeah, and perhaps one of the most frustrating things, and this goes for each of my 4 books, is meeting people that had access, or actually meeting the actual person, access to someone who may have been willing to talk to me, who was at an older age, somebody in their 80s or 90s, like your dad there would be could potentially be a great source of information. But of course, then the book comes out and you start doing promotion and you start meeting people. So it's just an inevitable part of doing nonfiction research, and then trying to draw a line somewhere and say, okay, this project is now done. I need to move on. I need to get it edited and proofread and then finally get it published and get it out there. You just have to stop at one point.
Right. Yeah. And that's why I like listening to your presentations. It adds stuff that I know the fringes of, but But yeah, he's got a couple buddies who are still around, and they're in their 70s and 80s who could probably fill you in because they're second, third generation Cleveland Italian and Jewish. So
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Harry. Okay. Well, we've come to, it's about 8:32. So what we're going to do is, we talked about this earlier. Rick wants to give away a book. So Rick's going to write down a number or pick a number in his head between 1 and 20. And when I say go, everybody will type in a number, and whoever gets closest or hits the number, Rick was going to be happy to send a signed book to you for the bullets, bombs, bullets, and bribes. So, and he'll be happy to do
Can
that.
we play policy to see who gets the book?
We just kept it amongst us. I think that would be okay, but I don't know if we have time for a policy again.
Okay. All right. Well, Rick,
You ready?
do you have a number in your head or written down?
I have a number written down.
Between 1 and 20.
I do.
Okay. So everybody aware of where you type in on the chat? Everybody aware? Okay. Well, I was going to say go, but it looks like everybody's gone already. So if you haven't typed, type now. And the first one in our list here that either gets closest or hits the number, we'll get Rick's book.
Gets
Let's
closest without going over?
No, just closest, because it, well,
Okay.
just closest. So if you're 1 over and everybody else is 3 over, the 1 over gets it. Okay.
All right. We'll work it out. You
Yeah.
ready? Tell me when you're ready.
We have anybody who wanted to. Have you typed in what you wanted already? Everybody that wanted to be eligible for the book? Is that affirmative? Okay. So anybody that wanted the book has typed in already. So here we go.
Okay.
We're going to look and see.
So no further bets, right?
No,
We're cut off.
we're right. The table is closed.
Okay. And the winning number is 9.
9. So
Lee
who's
Jackson.
Lee got it.
Oh.
Wow, Lee nailed it.
All right, Lee. Bravo.
And wait, I got to
Thank you,
remark.
Rick.
I got to remark on Jeff. You know, he's got to like put a twist on it. So he wrote pie.
Is that considered a mathematical expression or a number?
Just a number.
It's
Number
an irrational number.
Not number 6, number 9.
It's an irrational number.
When somebody tells me to pick a number between 1 and 10, I pick pi all the time. And if they say, no, pick another number, I say E.
Always the radical, right?
Yeah.
Always.
Isn't that
Radical right?
Radical.
Radical left.
Jeff, I thought better of you.
Oh, pie. Shalom says pie counts as 3.
It wasn't even close. Lee hit it, so it didn't matter.
Yeah, right. Lee hit the number. So everybody's happy with Lee winning, I'm sure. Rick is going to
Rick,
send off
has
a
the
book
has
to
the
Lee
mafia
Jackson.
kind of disappeared in
I'm
Cleveland?
sorry?
I'm
Say
sorry,
again?
Chris.
Mafia
What?
kind of disappeared in Cleveland,
Has the mafia disappeared? Is that was that
right?
Well, I wouldn't say they've disappeared as in completely gone, but I highly doubt they're getting together around a table daily or even once a week trying to plan some crime. I suspect that there's more intercity relationships going on, but I think they're still around, and there's still young men around that would like to be interested in that kind of a
5 minutes.
that kind of a
Well,
culture.
can have her move it.
But not nearly, don't have the power like they used to have. But I wouldn't say they're completely gone.
Yeah. Everybody always asks me that, being Italian, they say, do you know anybody in the mafia, or, can you get a hold of somebody because we want somebody to get leaned on a little bit, and we have a master photographer in Scott Morrison, And being Scott Morrison, he uses the term headshot a lot. And, you know, every time he says it, I cringe and I duck. So you can't say headshot to an Italian. You know, I got pictures.
Right.
People got, you know, okay, popping a cap, as they say.
Yeah, or a gamer. I mean, you know, the video game people, they you know, they're big into the headshots too.
That's great. Okay, so for today, we're going to wrap it up. I know all of us want to give a giant thank you to Rick Porrello for his wonderful presentation. And yes, everybody,
Thank you.
we really appreciate
Thank
you
you.
taking the time and giving us some of your time here at the Network Breakfast.
You're
really
welcome.
appreciate
You're
it.
welcome, all of you.
We really appreciate it if you could subscribe and you can comment below, and you could watch this video over and over and hear Rick as many times as you would like. So please join us again next week for the Network Breakfast as we all get together and we'll have another presentation, okay? All right, thank you so much, everybody out there, and thanks all my guests, all the members of the Network Breakfast, and of course, our featured speaker today, Rick Porrello. Bombs, Bullets, and Bribes. Please, you can see availability at your bookstore, Amazon, Kindle, Barnes & Noble. Get it any way you can. It's a good read. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.